Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one in your hands. It's the assumption in your mind. In a small Tennessee town, where pickup trucks outnumber traffic lights and everyone knows their neighbor's business, three young men were about to learn a lesson that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They thought they knew everything about guns, about respect, and about the quiet old man who lived at the end of Maple Street. They were wrong about all three. What started as harmless mockery of a veteran's weathered rifle would end with sirens, tears, and a truth so shocking it would divide their community forever. This is the story of how 15 minutes of arrogance can destroy 15 years of peace, and why you should never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book has seen more battles than you've seen birthdays. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Thomas Mitchell stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in one hand and his grandfather's old hunting rifle in the other. At 68 years old, Thomas had developed routines that kept him grounded in a world that seemed to change faster than he could keep up with. Every Saturday morning, without fail, he would clean his rifle on the front porch, the same ritual he had performed for the past 15 years since retiring from his job at the lumber mill. The rifle itself was nothing special to look at. A weathered Winchester Model 70 from 1952, its wooden stock showed decades of honest use, with scratches and dings that told stories of countless hunting trips and target practice sessions. The metal had developed a patina that spoke of age and care, though to the untrained eye, it might have looked neglected or outdated. Thomas knew every inch of that rifle, every scratch and worn spot, because it had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and now to him. It was more than just a gun. It was a family heirloom that connected him to generations of Mitchell men who had used it to put food on their tables and protect their families. Thomas had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a Marine sniper, but that was a chapter of his life he rarely discussed with anyone. The neighbors knew he was a veteran, but they didn't know about the Bronze Star hidden in his bedroom drawer, or about the confirmed kills that still visited him in his dreams, or about the steady hands that had once been feared by enemy forces across the Mekong Delta. He preferred it that way. The war was behind him, and he had worked hard to build a peaceful life in this quiet Tennessee town where the biggest excitement was usually the annual county fair. His daily routine was simple and methodical. He would wake at dawn, make his coffee, read the newspaper, tend to his small garden, and maintain his equipment. The rifle cleaning was both practical and therapeutic. It reminded him of his military training while giving his hands something productive to do. His neighbors had grown accustomed to seeing him on the porch with his rifle, and most respected his privacy and his right to maintain his property as he saw fit. But not everyone on Maple Street appreciated Thomas's quiet lifestyle. 3 houses down lived the Patterson family, and their 22-year-old son Jake had recently moved back home after dropping out of college. Jake brought with him 2 friends who had become regular fixtures around the neighborhood. Marcus Webb, 21, who worked part-time at a local auto shop and spent most of his money on video games and energy drinks, and Danny Rodriguez, 23, who had bounced between various jobs since high school and considered himself an expert on everything from cars to women to weapons. The 3 young men had developed a habit of hanging out in Jake's garage, drinking beer, playing loud music, and making comments about their neighbors. They had noticed Thomas and his Saturday morning ritual, and over time, their observations had turned into mockery. They would snicker and point whenever they saw him with his rifle, making jokes about the old man and his antique gun, and wondering aloud if it even worked anymore. "Look at that thing," Danny would say, gesturing toward Thomas's porch. "My grandfather's shotgun looks newer than that relic. Does he even have ammunition for it? Or is he just playing pretend?" Marcus would chime in with his own observations. "I bet it hasn't been fired in 20 years. Probably rusted shut. My dad's got a rifle from the 80s that looks 10 times better than that museum piece." Jake, being the youngest of the 3 and eager to impress his friends, would add his own commentary. "Maybe we should tell him about gun shows. He could probably trade that paperweight in for something made in this century." Or maybe he just likes the attention, sitting out there every Saturday morning like he's guarding the neighborhood. Their comments grew bolder over time, fueled by youth, ignorance, and the kind of confidence that comes from having never faced real consequences. They began to speak loudly enough for Thomas to hear, though he never acknowledged their words. His military training had taught him to pick his battles, and three immature young men making comments about his rifle hardly seemed worth his attention. He had faced enemy snipers and survived artillery barges. A few neighborhood kids with big mouths were not going to disturb his peace. But Thomas's lack of response only emboldened the trio. They interpreted his silence as weakness or embarrassment, never considering that it might be wisdom or restraint. In their minds, they had identified an easy target, an old man with an old gun who was too timid or too proud to defend himself. They had no idea that Thomas could hear every word they said, or that he was making mental notes about their behavior, their schedules, and their attitudes. The escalation began on a particularly hot Saturday in late July. Thomas was on his porch, as usual, methodically cleaning his rifle with the same care and attention he had shown for decades. The three young men were in Jake's garage with the door open, music playing, and several empty beer cans evidence of their morning activities. The combination of alcohol, boredom, and peer pressure created a dangerous cocktail of poor judgment. "Hey, old man," Danny called out, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "Is that thing even loaded, or are you just polishing for show?" Thomas looked up briefly, but didn't respond. He continued his cleaning routine, running his cleaning rod through the barrel with smooth, practiced motions. "I don't think he heard you," Marcus said, laughing. Maybe his hearing aids are turned off. Jake, encouraged by his friend's laughter, decided to join in. Maybe he's deaf from all those years of not shooting that antique. "When's the last time you actually fired that thing, Mr. Mitchell?" "The Civil War." The comments continued for several minutes, each one a little louder and more disrespectful than the last. Thomas finished cleaning his rifle, checked the action to ensure it was functioning properly, and carefully loaded it with 5 rounds from a box of ammunition he kept in his jacket pocket. The young men were too busy laughing and congratulating themselves on their wit to notice the precision and familiarity with which Thomas handled his weapon. "Look at him," Danny said, pointing directly at Thomas. "Still going through the motions like he's some kind of soldier or something. I bet that rifle hasn't been shot since Bush was president." "The first Bush." Thomas stood up slowly, his rifle in his hands, and walked to the edge of his porch. For the first time since their harassment began, he looked directly at the three young men. His expression was calm, almost serene, but there was something in his eyes that should have warned them they were treading on dangerous ground. "Boys," Thomas said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them, "you seem mighty interested in my rifle and my business. If you're that curious about firearms and their capabilities, perhaps you'd like a demonstration." The casual way he spoke, combined with the rifle in his hands and the sudden attention he was giving them, should have been enough to make any reasonable person reconsider their approach. But the three young men were too caught up in their performance and too influenced by alcohol and false confidence to recognize the subtle shift in dynamics. "Oh, he talks," Danny said, grinning at his friends. "And he wants to show off his antique. What are you going to do, old man? Tell us worse stories. Shoot at some cans? Show us how they did things back in the day." Marcus joined in, emboldened by what he perceived as victory in getting a response from Thomas. "Yeah, let's see what that old thing can do. I bet it misfires on the first shot. Assuming you even remember how to load it properly." Jake laughed and took another drink from his beer. "My great-grandfather had a rifle like that. It's hanging on the wall in my uncle's den now. Makes a great conversation piece, but I wouldn't trust it to kill a rabbit, let alone anything dangerous." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, as if considering their words. He looked down at his rifle, then back at the three young men. The morning sun was climbing higher, and the neighborhood was starting to come alive with the sounds of lawn mowers and children playing. It was shaping up to be a beautiful day, the kind of day when people should be enjoying life and treating their neighbors with kindness and respect. You know, Thomas said, his voice still calm and conversational. This rifle has quite a history. It's been in my family for over 70 years. My grandfather used it to feed his family during the Depression. My father carried it through 3 deer seasons without missing a single shot. I've had it for the past 30 years, and in all that time, it's never let me down. He paused, letting his words sink in. The thing about old rifles, boys, is that they were built to last. They were made by craftsmen who took pride in their work, using materials and techniques that modern manufacturers often cut corners on. This Winchester has seen more action than all your modern rifles combined, and it's still as accurate and reliable as the day it left the factory. Danny rolled his eyes. Right, sure it is. Ancient technology, ancient results. You can't tell me that 70-year-old rifle is anywhere near as good as modern guns. The metallurgy alone. The metallurgy is superior, Thomas interrupted quietly. The steel used in rifles from this era was often of higher quality than what's commonly used today. The tolerances were tighter, the craftsmanship more meticulous. But I suppose you'd have to understand firearms to appreciate the difference. The subtle insult wasn't lost on the 3 young men, but rather than recognizing it as a warning, they took it as a challenge. They had started this confrontation as a way to amuse themselves, but now it had become a matter of pride. They couldn't back down in front of each other, couldn't admit that maybe they had misjudged the quiet old man and his weathered rifle. "Prove it," Danny said, standing up from his lawn chair. "If that old gun is so great, show us. Put your money where your mouth is." Thomas studied the young man's face, noting the flush of alcohol, the aggressive posture, the need to prove himself in front of his friends. He had seen that look before, in young soldiers who didn't yet understand the weight of their words or the consequences of their actions. Most of them learn eventually. The lucky ones learned before it was too late. "What exactly are you proposing?" Thomas asked. Danny looked around the neighborhood, then pointed toward the tree line about 200 yards away where the street ended and the woods began. "See that dead tree trunk, the tall one with the broken top? I bet you can't hit it from here. I bet that rifle isn't accurate enough, and I bet your eyes aren't sharp enough, and I bet your hands shake too much to make a clean shot." Marcus and Jake nodded their agreement, caught up in the moment, and eager to see their friend humiliate the old man who had dared to challenge their assessment of his weapon. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would change their understanding of firearms, respect, and the dangers of judging people based on appearances. Thomas looked toward the tree Danny had indicated. It was a challenging shot, requiring precision and skill, but well within his capabilities. He had made much more difficult shots under far worse conditions, with lives hanging in the balance. This would be almost routine, except for the audience and the implications of what he was about to reveal about himself. "And if I make the shot?" Thomas asked. Danny laughed. "If you make that shot with that antique rifle, I'll personally apologize to you and your gun. But when you miss, you admit that thing is just for show, and you stop pretending to be some kind of marksman." Thomas nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But let's make this interesting. If I make the shot, all 3 of you apologize not just to me, but to every veteran in this neighborhood. And you keep your opinions about other people's property to yourselves from now on." The 3 young men exchanged glances. The stakes had been raised, but they were confident in their position. How accurate could a 70-year-old rifle really be? How steady could the hands of a 68-year-old man possibly be? They were about to find out that some questions are better left unasked, and some challenges are better left unmade. As Thomas raised his rifle and began to sight in on the distant tree, neighbors started to emerge from their houses, drawn by the unusual activity and the raised voices. Mrs. Henderson from next door stepped onto her porch, concerned about the commotion. Mr. and Mrs. Chong from across the street paused their gardening to watch. Even some of the children stopped their play to see what was happening. The stage was set for a demonstration that would reveal truths none of them were prepared for, and consequences that would ripple through their quiet neighborhood for years to come. Thomas took his time preparing for the shot, and his methodical approach began to unnerve the three young men who had expected a quick attempt and an even quicker failure. He checked the wind by observing the movement of leaves on nearby trees, noted the angle of the sun and how it might affect his sight picture, and made subtle adjustments to his stance that spoke of decades of experience and training. The Winchester felt familiar and comfortable in his hands, like shaking hands with an old friend. He had fired thousands of rounds through this rifle over the years, and he knew exactly how it behaved under different conditions. The trigger broke at exactly 3.5 pounds of pressure, just as it had for the past 30 years. The barrel had a very slight preference for shooting just a hair to the left at long distances, a characteristic he had learned to compensate for automatically. "Any day now, old man," Danny called out, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. There was something about the way Thomas was handling his rifle that didn't match their expectations of a doddering old man with an obsolete weapon. Thomas ignored the comment and continued his preparation. He settled into a classic standing shooting position, left elbow braced against his ribs, right elbow high, the rifle stock firmly seated in his shoulder pocket. His breathing slowed and deepened as he entered the focused mental state that had kept him alive in Vietnam and had made him one of the most feared snipers in his unit. Through his scope, the dead tree came into sharp focus. It was approximately 215 yards away, he estimated, with a slight crosswind from the left. The trunk was about 18 inches in diameter at chest height, which would be considered an easy shot for someone with his training and experience. But the three young men watching him had no way of knowing that this was routine for someone who had once put a bullet through an enemy sniper's scope from over 400 yards away. The neighborhood had grown quiet around them. Even the children seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Mrs. Henderson was standing on her porch with her arms crossed, a worried expression on her face. She had lived next to Thomas for 8 years and had always found him to be a polite, quiet neighbor who kept to himself and never caused any trouble. She hoped these young men weren't about to discover something they weren't prepared for. Mr. Chong had stopped pretending to garden and was watching openly now. As a Korean War veteran himself, he recognized the signs of serious marksmanship preparation when he saw them. He had a sinking feeling that the three cocky young men were about to learn a very expensive lesson about making assumptions. Thomas took a deep breath, let half of it out, and began his final sight alignment. The crosshairs of his scope settled on a specific spot on the tree trunk, a dark knot in the wood that made a perfect aiming point. His finger found the trigger and began to apply pressure, smooth and steady, just as he had been taught decades ago. "He's actually going to try it," Marcus whispered to his friends, and for the first time, there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "Of course he's going to try it," Danny replied, but he too was beginning to have doubts. The old man's confidence was absolute, and his preparation was thorough in a way that suggested real expertise rather than hopeful fumbling. Jake said nothing. He was starting to wonder if maybe they had made a mistake in challenging Thomas. There was something about the way the old man held his rifle, the way he had positioned himself, the calm certainty in his demeanor that was making Jake's stomach twist with anxiety. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed off the houses and sent a flock of birds exploding from a nearby oak tree. The sound was crisp and clean, without the hesitation or misfire that the three young men had been expecting. Thomas absorbed the recoil smoothly, keeping the rifle steady and following through with his shot just as he had been trained to do. For a moment, nobody moved. The echo of the gunshot faded away, leaving an almost oppressive silence in its wake. Thomas lowered his rifle and looked toward the tree, though at that distance, it would be impossible to see the results with the naked eye. "Did he hit it?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Danny squinted toward the tree lean, trying to make out any sign of impact. "I can't tell from here." We need to go check. But Thomas was already walking toward his truck, parked in his driveway. No need to walk, he said calmly. We could drive down there and take a look. He paused and looked back at the three young men. Unless, of course, you're not interested in seeing the results. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and the three friends found themselves trapped by their own bravado. They couldn't back down now, not with half the neighborhood watching. They piled into Jake's car and followed Thomas's truck down the street toward the wooded area where the dead tree stood. As they got closer to the tree, Danny felt his confidence evaporating. Even from 50 yards away, he could see a fresh, light-colored scar in the dark bark of the dead trunk, positioned exactly where Thomas had been aiming. When they got out of their vehicles and walked closer, the evidence was undeniable. The bullet had struck the tree dead center, right through the dark knot that Thomas had used as his aiming point. The impact had punched a clean hole through the trunk, which was over a foot thick at that point. Splinters and fragments of wood were scattered on the ground behind the tree, evidence of the bullet's devastating passage through the hardwood. Holy shit, Marcus breathed, forgetting himself in his amazement. Danny walked around the tree, examining the entry and exit wounds with growing disbelief. The shot was perfect, absolutely perfect. Not just close, not just good enough, but precisely where it had been intended to go. The level of skill required to make such a shot was far beyond what he had thought possible for anyone, let alone a 68-year-old man with a 70-year-old rifle. Jake was staring at the bullet hole with his mouth open. He had grown up around guns, had been hunting with his father and uncle since he was 12 years old, and he knew an exceptional shot when he saw one. This wasn't luck or accident. This was the result of serious training and extensive experience. Thomas stood quietly beside his truck, watching the three young men process what they were seeing. He felt no satisfaction in their amazement, no pleasure in their obvious discomfort. If anything, he felt sad that it had come to this, that their disrespect and mockery had forced him to reveal skills he preferred to keep private. "Ow!" Danny finally managed to ask. "How did you make that shot?" Thomas considered the question for a moment. These young men had started the morning thinking they knew everything about guns and marksmanship. They had ended it discovering that their knowledge was superficial at best, and their assumptions were dangerously wrong. Perhaps it was time for them to learn something useful. "Training," Thomas said simply. "Lots and lots of training. This rifle and I have been through more together than you might imagine. We've practiced in rain, snow, wind, heat, cold, day, night, and every condition in between. I know exactly how it shoots, and it knows exactly what I expect from it." He walked over to the tree and examined the bullet hole. "This was actually an easy shot for me. The range was modest, the conditions were ideal, and I had all the time in the world to set up properly. In Vietnam, I regularly made shots at twice this distance under much more difficult circumstances." The word Vietnam hit the three young men like a physical blow. Suddenly, everything made sense, and nothing made sense at the same time. Thomas wasn't just some old man with an old gun. He was a combat veteran, trained by the military, tested in actual warfare. The rifle they had been mocking wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a precision instrument in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. "You were in Vietnam?" Jake asked, his voice small and ashamed. Thomas nodded. "2 tours. Marine Corps Sniper. I spent 26 months in country, most of it crawling through jungles and rice paddies with this rifle, doing things I prefer not to talk about." He looked at each of them in turn. "Things that were necessary at the time, but not something I'm proud of or eager to relive through storytelling." Danny felt sick to his stomach. Not only had he been completely wrong about Thomas and his capabilities, but he had been mocking a combat veteran, someone who had risked his life in service to his country. The shame was overwhelming, made worse by the knowledge that half the neighborhood had witnessed his arrogance and ignorance. "Mr. Mitchell," Danny said, his voice cracking slightly, "I am so sorry. We didn't know. We were just fooling around, and we got carried away, and we said things that were stupid and disrespectful. I can't believe we acted like that." Marcus nodded vigorously. "He's right, sir. We were completely out of line. We made assumptions about you and your rifle that were totally wrong, and we said things that we never should have said. We're really, really sorry." Jake was crying now, tears of shame and regret running down his cheeks. "My grandfather was in World War II, and my dad always taught me to respect veterans. I don't know what got into me. I'm so ashamed of how he acted." Thomas looked at the three young men, seeing their genuine remorse and understanding the lesson they had learned. But he also knew that some lessons come with consequences that extend beyond simple apologies. "Apologies are a good start," he said quietly, "but words are easy. Actions matter more. You three spent the morning making fun of something you didn't understand, disrespecting someone you had never bothered to get to know, and acting like experts on subjects where you had no real knowledge." He gestured toward the bullet hole in the tree. "This rifle, which you call an antique and a museum piece, has never failed me in over 30 years of ownership. It's more accurate than most modern rifles, more reliable than most modern rifles, and, in the right hands, more deadly than most modern rifles. You judged it by its appearance rather than its capabilities." Thomas walked back toward his truck. "The same way you judged me. You saw an old man going through what you assumed were meaningless motions, and you decided that made me fair game for your entertainment. You never considered that maybe there was more to the story than what you could see from across the street." The three young men followed him, their earlier confidence replaced by crushing embarrassment. They had learned more in the past hour about firearms, respect, and humility than they had learned in years of thinking they knew everything. But their education was far from over. As they drove back toward Maple Street, they noticed several of their neighbors standing in their yards, clearly waiting for them. Word of the confrontation and its outcome had spread quickly through the small community, and people wanted to know what had happened. Mrs. Henderson approached Thomas as he got out of his truck. "Thomas, is everything all right? We heard the gunshot and saw you all drive off toward the woods." Thomas nodded. "Everything's fine, Eleanor. Just a small demonstration to clear up some misunderstandings." Mr. Chong walked over from his yard, a knowing smile on his face. "Let me guess. These young men learned something about making assumptions." "Something like that," Thomas replied. Jake, Marcus, and Danny stood beside Jake's car, unsure what to do or say. They were acutely aware that their neighbors were watching them, evaluating them, judging their behavior. The story of their confrontation with Thomas would be all over the neighborhood by evening, and they would have to live with the consequences of their actions for a long time to come. But the immediate consequences were just beginning to unfold. As Thomas walked toward his house, he paused and turned back to the three young men. "Boys," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air, "I want you to remember something. This morning, you challenged me to prove myself and my rifle. I did that. But the real test isn't whether an old gun can still shoot straight, or whether an old man still remembers his training. The real test is whether young men can learn to show respect for things they don't understand and people they've never taken the time to know." He looked at each of them one more time. "I hope you pass that test, because if you don't, you're going to find life a lot more difficult than it needs to be." As Thomas disappeared into his house, the three friends were left standing in the street, surrounded by neighbors who now knew exactly what kind of people they were and what kind of mistake they had made. The morning had started with them feeling superior and confident. It was ending with them feeling small, foolish, and deeply ashamed. But their real education was still to come. By evening, word of the incident would reach people who knew Thomas's full story, people who understood exactly who he was and what he had done during his time in Vietnam. And when that information began to spread through the community, the three young men would discover that their morning of mockery had consequences far more serious than simple embarrassment. By 6 o'clock that evening, Jake's phone was ringing constantly. Word of the confrontation with Thomas Mitchell had spread throughout their small town with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. But the calls weren't coming from friends wanting to hear the details of their humiliation. They were coming from people who knew things about Thomas that the three young men had never imagined. The first call came from Jake's Uncle Robert, a Vietnam veteran himself who had served in the same division as Thomas, though in a different unit. His voice was tight with anger when Jake answered the phone. "Jake, please tell me you didn't really mock Tom Mitchell's rifle and challenge him to prove himself," Robert said without preamble. Jake's stomach dropped. His uncle's tone told him that this was about to get much worse. "Uncle Robert, we didn't know. We were just fooling around, and we said some stupid things, and then he made this incredible shot, and we apologized. We feel terrible about it." "You feel terrible now," Robert said, "but you have no idea how terrible you should feel. Do you know who Thomas Mitchell is? Do you have any idea what that man did in Vietnam?" "He said he was a sniper," Jake replied weakly. "He was the sniper, Jake." Tom Mitchell was one of the most decorated snipers in Marine Corps history. He has over 60 confirmed kills, a Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Navy Cross for valor under fire. The man you were mocking this morning is a genuine American hero who saved countless American lives by eliminating enemy commanders and snipers who were killing our boys. Jake felt like he was going to be sick. A Navy Cross was one step below the Medal of Honor, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat. He had spent the morning mocking a man who had been officially recognized as one of the bravest soldiers in American military history. "There's more," Robert continued, his voice getting angrier. "That rifle you called an antique and a museum piece? Tom used that same rifle to kill a North Vietnamese colonel from over 600 yards away, breaking up an enemy offensive that would have overrun an American firebase. He used it to eliminate enemy snipers who had been terrorizing our patrols for weeks. That old gun has probably saved more American lives than any other individual weapon in the entire war." Jake was crying now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his mistake. "Uncle Robert, we didn't know. How are we supposed to know?" "You weren't supposed to know, Jake. That's the point." Tom Mitchell never talks about his service because he's a humble man who doesn't believe in bragging about doing his duty. But that didn't give you the right to mock him or disrespect him. And it sure as hell didn't give you the right to challenge a man who could put a bullet through your eye from 3 blocks away. The call ended with Robert telling Jake that he was ashamed of his nephew's behavior, and that Jake needed to find a way to make this right, though he wasn't sure what that might involve. Marcus was having a similar conversation with his grandfather, who had served in Korea and had heard stories about Thomas Mitchell from other veterans over the years. Danny's father, a police officer, was furious when he learned what had happened, not just because of the disrespect shown to a veteran, but because his son had been drinking and acting like a fool in public. But the phone calls were just the beginning. By the next morning, the story had reached the local veterans organizations, and members of the American Legion, VFW, and Marine Corps League were calling each other, sharing what they knew about Thomas Mitchell and expressing their outrage at how he had been treated. Frank Morrison, the commander of the local VFW post, had served under Thomas in Vietnam and knew him better than most. When he heard what had happened, he decided it was time for the community to learn the truth about their quiet neighbor. "Tom's been living here for 15 years, Frank told a gathering of veterans at the VFW hall that Sunday afternoon. "He keeps to himself, never causes any trouble, never asks for anything from anybody. Most people don't even know he's a veteran, let alone what kind of veteran he is." Frank had brought with him a manila folder filled with photocopied documents, newspaper clippings, and official records. He spread them out on the table for the other veterans to see. "Tom Mitchell isn't just any sniper," Frank continued. "He holds the record for the longest confirmed kill shot by a Marine sniper in Vietnam. 873 yards with that same Winchester rifle those punks were making fun of. He eliminated an enemy sniper who had killed 12 Americans and wounded dozens more." The room was silent as Frank continued reading from Thomas's military records. The list of his accomplishments was staggering. 63 confirmed kills, multiple commendations for valor, 3 separate instances where he had saved entire units from ambush by eliminating enemy commanders before they could coordinate attacks. The Navy Cross citation, Frank said, pulling out an official document, reads in part, for extraordinary heroism while serving as a sniper with the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines. Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell, at great personal risk and under intense enemy fire, eliminated 4 enemy snipers and a forward observer who were directing accurate fire against American positions. His actions prevented the enemy from overrunning the position and saved an estimated 40 American lives. One of the younger veterans in the room whistled softly. I had no idea. He's been living right here in town all this time, and none of us knew. That's how Tom wants it, Frank replied. He's never been comfortable with attention or praise. He did his job, came home, and tried to build a normal life. But that doesn't mean he should have to put up with disrespect from a bunch of kids who don't know what they're talking about. The veterans decided that the community needed to know the truth about Thomas Mitchell, not to embarrass him or make him uncomfortable, but to ensure that something like this never happened again. They began reaching out to local newspapers, sharing Thomas's story with anyone who would listen. By Wednesday, the story had appeared in the local newspaper under the headline, Local Hero Forced to Defend His Honor. The article detailed Thomas's military service, his decorations, and the incident with the 3 young men. It painted a picture of a humble war hero who had been subjected to ridicule and disrespect by neighbors who knew nothing about his sacrifices for their freedom. The community's reaction was swift and overwhelming. Thomas's mailbox filled with letters of support and apology. Local businesses offered him discounts and free services. The mayor issued a proclamation declaring Thomas Mitchell Day and invited him to be Grand Marshal of the upcoming 4th of July parade. But Thomas himself was deeply uncomfortable with all the attention. He had spent 15 years maintaining his privacy, and now his entire life story was public knowledge. He felt exposed and vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since coming home from the war. The 3 young men who had started it all found themselves social pariahs overnight. Jake was fired from his part-time job at a local store when customers complained about being served by someone who had disrespected a war hero. Marcus was asked to leave his volunteer position with the Youth Baseball League. Danny faced the worst consequences of all when his father's police chief learned about the incident and suggested that perhaps Danny should find a new place to live. The community's anger was intense and sustained. These weren't just 3 young men who had made a mistake. They had disrespected one of the most decorated veterans in the town's history, a man who had risked his life repeatedly to protect American soldiers. Their apologies, however sincere, seemed inadequate given the magnitude of their error. Jake's family was particularly affected. His father, a respected businessman in the community, found that customers were avoiding his store. His mother was asked to step down from her position on the school board. The family name, once well regarded in the community, had become associated with disrespect and ignorance. But the most painful consequence for the 3 young men was learning the full truth about what they had done. As more details of Thomas's service record became public, they realized they hadn't just mocked an old man with an old gun. They had mocked a genuine American hero, a man who had faced death dozens of times to protect people like them. The rifle they had called an antique and a museum piece had been used to save American lives in some of the most dangerous missions of the Vietnam War. The man they had assumed was weak or foolish was actually one of the most lethal and effective soldiers in American military history. 2 weeks after the incident, Jake worked up the courage to approach Thomas's house. He found the older man in his garden, tending to his tomatoes with the same quiet concentration he brought to everything else in his life. "Mr. Mitchell," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know you probably don't want to see me, but I need to say something." Thomas looked up from his plants. The anger he might have felt had been replaced by something that looked almost like pity. "What is it, Jake?" "I've been learning about who you really are, about what you did in the war, about the lives you saved. And I realize now that what we did wasn't just stupid or disrespectful. It was horrible. We mocked a genuine hero, a man who risked everything to protect people like us." Jake was crying again, but he forced himself to continue. "I can't take back what we said or what we did. I can't undo the embarrassment we caused you or the way we made you reveal things about yourself that you wanted to keep private. But I need you to know that I understand now what we did, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it." Thomas set down his gardening tools and studied the young man's face. He saw genuine remorse, real understanding of the consequences of his actions, and a humility that had been completely absent 3 weeks earlier. "Jake," Thomas said quietly, "the hardest part of being a soldier isn't the fighting or the danger or even the killing. It's coming home and trying to fit back into a world where people don't understand what you've been through or what you've had to do." He gestured toward his house, his garden, his quiet neighborhood life. "I've spent the last 40 years trying to be normal, trying to be just another neighbor who minds his own business and doesn't cause any trouble. What happened between us forced me back into a spotlight I never wanted, made me relive experiences I'd rather forget." Jake nodded, understanding that his apology could never repair the damage he had helped cause. But Thomas continued, "Maybe some good can come from it. Maybe other young people will hear this story and learn something about respecting their elders, about not making assumptions about people they don't know, about the sacrifices that veterans have made for their freedom." Thomas extended his hand to Jake. "Your apology is accepted. What you do with the lesson you've learned is up to you." Jake shook the older man's hand, feeling both relief and the weight of responsibility. He had been forgiven, but he would never forget the lesson he had learned about respect, assumptions, and the hidden depths of quiet heroes. The incident changed their small town in ways both obvious and subtle. Thomas Mitchell became a local celebrity, though he never enjoyed the attention. The 3 young men eventually rebuilt their lives, but they carried the memory of their mistake with them forever. Most importantly, the community learned that heroes don't always announce themselves, that wisdom often comes in quiet packages, and that the most dangerous assumption you can make is that you know everything about someone based on what you can see from across the street. Years later, when people told the story of the morning, when 3 young men learned a lesson they would never forget, they always ended it the same way. Never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book has seen more battles than you've seen birthdays.